So tonight I have a mystery guest, which is one of my local members of this group. And before he comes in, he'll be in a minute. He got talking to Debbie and got distracted, I'm afraid. Maybe Jung isn't quite so important to him as talking to my wife. Anyway, I assume everyone can hear me fine. And hello, Andreas, welcome, and Dan, hi. So I wanted to mention one thing right at the beginning here. On Saturday night, I saw a special which was on public television. It was the first of a series of programs called World on the Brink. And the very first thing in this documentary was a quote from Professor Edward O. Wilson of Harvard University. And Professor Wilson said the following. Professor Wilson said the following. We have a Star Wars civilization with Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. Unquote. You know, what could possibly go wrong? So, one of the reasons that I'm doing this is to hopefully ameliorate the effect of it over time, but this is a series that's on public television. You can probably see episode 1 in replay. I urge you to take a look at it. And come in. And it talks about, I was just talking about this public television program called World on the Brink, which started on Saturday night, the first episode, and it seems to be a series that they're going to do. And just so you can hear it too, I'll just read this quote once more. Quote of Professor Edward O. Wilson of Harvard University. We have created a Star Wars civilization with Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. Oh, what could possibly go wrong? So I want to give a sense of what could possibly go wrong. This week on a video that I made probably a year and a half ago, maybe, or at least a year ago, called The Higher Man, the Essential Content of the Unconscious. One of my subscribers made a comment, and one of the things, and this comment was on this image of, let's see if I can show you. Okay, this is a image that was painted by Raphael, and it is the vision that Ezekiel had in the Bible, so the Old Testament. And she said this picture represents astrotheology, the 4 fixed signs of the zodiac: Bull, Taurus, the Lion, Leo, Eagle, Scorpio, and Man, Aquarius. This shows the relationship of man's inner battle towards higher consciousness through knowing thyself, finding the Christ within. As above, so below. The Christus oil connects our higher consciousness to our lower. And then she quotes Luke 17:21, which says, neither shall they say, lo, here, or lo, there, for behold, the kingdom of God is within you. Okay, so I thought this was a very good pointer because I went back and I looked at the New American Bible. And what I found there in a footnote to this verse was a comment that said that the preposition within could be translated as among. So in the King James Version, which I have, it's translated as within, but in the New American Bible, it's among. And so it seems to me that, so here's the footnote, I'll read it to you. Among you, the Greek preposition translated as among can also be translated as within. In the light of other statements in Luke's gospel about the presence of the kingdom, Luke 10:9, 11, and 11:20, among is to be preferred, quote unquote. I hold this translation in the King, then this is me responding. I hold with the translation in the King James Version of the Bible, which matches the version you, my subscriber, expressed. This points to the psychic fact that the kingdom of God is within, in the psyche, and therefore not out in the physical world, where fundamentalism always wants to put it with the physical existence of all the facts of the Bible, for example. This is a very subtle change in perspective and has caused many Christians to imagine that the kingdom of heaven is in the physical world rather than in the world of the psyche. Obviously, this makes a huge difference in the perspective of humanity itself. Dr. Jung understood this significant distinction, which is the cause of many wars in the past 2,000 years, and said explicitly in answer to Job, paragraph 752, but religious statements, without exception, have to do with the reality of the psyche and not with the reality of the physis, the physical world. And he said earlier in the same paragraph, it does not matter at all that a physically impossible fact is asserted, because all religious assertions are physical impossibilities. If they were not so, they would, as I said earlier, necessarily be treated in the textbooks of natural science. So let's see. So my further comment here is, this may explain why football players who cross the goal line to score a touchdown point in the wrong direction, to the sky rather than to their own heart. The reference to Luke 11 in this footnote is a pointer to the Lord's Prayer, which from a psychological point of view is a series of petitions to connect the ego to the self, the God image, which is the second and more important center in Jungian psychology. I have discussed this in group in 3 parts. You can see the first part at this link, and the other 2 are linked beneath this video. So I will now give you the link to the petitions of the Lord's Prayer. And these, from a psychological point of view, are petitions to the self, to the God image. And let's put this up here. Okay, so that's the first video that discusses the 7 petitions of the Lord's Prayer as they are aimed at you, at yourself, at your deep unconscious, rather than to some being that's out there in the stratosphere. So let's see, one other thing I wanted to talk about. Okay, just very quickly. So here's the Secret of the Golden Flower. This is the actual book to which Dr. Jung gave a commentary. And the point of the golden flower is that it is the emerging light in any human consciousness. In other words, our unconscious is from the self, always trying to become its complete self. And so the archetypes and everything else is trying to push out and experience life completely. And that's what the golden flower represents in Taoism. So it happens that in this book, which I was discussing last week, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, Volume 2, which is an outstanding book, and I urge you to purchase it. There is an essay from a Jungian analyst who knows something about Taoist alchemy and the secret of the golden flower. And her name is Anne Chia-Yi Lee. The name of her essay, which begins on page 247, is The Receptive and the Creative, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, in the Light of Taoist Alchemy. And I thought I would read here she was talking about the lumen naturae, which is the natural light, the divine spark buried in darkness, in matter. And here's what she says. In Western alchemy, this dormant true energy lying in the abyss is synonymous with lumen naturae, the divine spark buried in the darkness. The alchemists discovered that in the very darkness of nature there is hidden a little spark. It is the light of darkness itself. Hence it is capable of illuminating its own darkness from within. In consequence, the alchemists realized, quote, the light that is lighted in the heart by the grace of the Holy Spirit, that same light of nature, however feeble it may be, is more important to them than the light which shines in the darkness and which the darkness comprehended not. In connection with Taoist alchemy, this light that is lighted in the heart is elaborated as the golden flower. The golden flower is the light. It is the true energy of the Great One, quote unquote. As we know from the perspective of Taoist alchemy, every individual was at one with the Great One prior to birth. The Great One manifests itself as the primal spirit in each individual. However, at the moment when one was born into the physical world, the conscious spirit inhales the energy. It mercilessly overtakes the lead of the primal spirit, and day and night the conscious spirit lets its restless movement become bound to the feelings and desires. The energy of the primal spirit is unavoidably at risk of being entirely exhausted due to the huge energetic imbalance between the conscious spirit and the primal spirit. This explains why Taoist alchemists practice circulating the light in tranquility. They strive to re-energize the terribly disturbed vitality of the primal spirit with the hope to redeem it from the grasp of the conscious spirit. As they believed, if man attains this one, he becomes alive. If he loses it, he dies. This light is the golden flower, the essential energy of the Great One. It is the yang energy which sits in between the two broken yin lines in the Kang Trigon. It It is the lumen naturae, the light of darkness itself. In the case of Jung's adventures in his Red Book, I suppose it is the soul that Jung tried to retrieve from the dark psychic inner world. Okay, so that was the essential thing I wanted to read there, I think. Okay, a little earlier in this essay, she also had a couple of other things that are worth mentioning. Okay, I will address your question, Taurus, but let me finish this first. In our time, science and technology count more than spirituality. Their development seems to be guiding us to a new way of life in which people interact more with technology than directly with people. Life is being directed to a mode of being that is bright, clear, precise, certain, concrete, stable, and ordered. This gives an impression that in our modern time, thunder is no longer the voice of God, nor is lightning his avenging missile. No river contains a spirit, no tree means a man's life, no snake is the embodiment of wisdom, and no mountain still harbors a great demon, just as Jung anticipated. So then she goes on. Jung made a turn. He admitted that he had been judging his soul with his knowledge and had turned her into a scientific object. However, on the way to refinding the soul, Jung discovered the soul to be a living and self-existing being through whom he existed. In later years, in the epilogue of the book Psychology and Alchemy, Jung voiced this understanding again in response to the rationalism of his time. Quote, "Gone were the days when the psyche was still for the most part outside the body and imagined those greater things which the body could not grasp. Indeed, the intellect of our time has pushed even further the belief that the body constitutes the entirety of the individual and that consciousness is the sum total of the psyche. It follows from this that on the one hand, AI robot, or artificial intelligence robot, and AI robot entities will soon have equivalent personalities, and on the other hand, we humans can look forward to immortality through medical surgery. All the while, we ignore the dying polar bears and wild animals. In fact, besides Jung, Marie-Louise von Franz was also concerned about the overly one-sided development in which patriarchal order overshadowed the maternal domain of outer and inner nature. She warned that the divine might be lost in this development. Eventually, the split of the psyche and matter becomes the critical predicament before us. On human development, Jung reflected, quote, Nature has never yet been taken in by well-meaning advice. The only thing that moves nature is causal necessity, and that goes for human nature too. The developing personality obeys no caprice, no command, no insight, only brute necessities. Any other development would be no better than individualism. Our time is overly ego-dominated. We seem to think that anything and everything human beings can invent will be for the good. This is a dangerous inflation. In an interview in 2014, the outstanding British scientist Stephen Hawking expressed his concerns about the full development of artificial intelligence technology. He fears that it would take off on its own and redesign itself at an ever-increasing rate. It is not at all an empty threat to human existence. According to his understanding, humans would not be able to compete with AI via their slow biological evolution and eventually would be superseded. This is where human ingenuity may well lead us in our ego inflation. Okay, so that was the cheery excerpts of the essay from Anchia Lee, which is from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, edited by Murray Stein and Thomas Arst, Volume 2. I urge you to get both Volumes 1 and 2 and read the different perspectives on the Red Book from these 50 different Jungian analysts. So, going back now. Thank you, Andreas, for addressing the issue. So Taurus has said, "Hi, Skip, can you comment on how cannabis smoking affects the human psyche in a Jungian perspective? What causes the paranoia, euphoria, thought patterns, etc.?" Andreas says, "Taurus, I think that I might be able to answer this one. I believe that Jung would have similar opinions between alcohol and marijuana. I agree with Andreas. It can release the shadow a bit, which is not a bad thing." Taurus, right, cannabis has a much psychoactive effect, though, but would like to know why cannabis has its effects it has on human mind. Alcohol is also interesting as it makes a lot of people violent. Andreas, drinking and drug use is often seen as being motivated by a desire for unconsciousness. To my knowledge, Jung does not address psychedelics or marijuana. You never hear alcohol causing schizophrenia, but a bad joint can. I personally experienced depersonalization for 2 months from a weed. And then Nick Eusebius says, dissociation can be a liberating experience. Andreas says, one of Jung's followers, von Franz, in an interview compares LSD to a god, little g, pagan god. It's a Newman. She used a negative tone. Well, from my perspective, alcohol and any drug use is a way to, let's call it, permeate the transcendent function so that things can come up from the unconscious more easily. The problem is that there's a lot of things down there. There are demons and devils as well as good things. And if you don't know what you're doing, you can kill yourself. But anyway, John, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, but as a general principle, that sounds about right when you're dealing with liberating the unconscious.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think these things liberate the unconscious, but you don't necessarily always want to do that. And I've had quite a few experiences with liquor over the years, given my age. I nearly killed myself in college on liquor. And I don't know that it's, I don't know that it was a good experience. I mean, I'll tell you about that experience. When I was a freshman in college, on November 25th, 1964, which happened to be the day before Thanksgiving, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. I had gotten a ride in a car that was owned by a senior from upstate New York to Washington, where my girlfriend of the time lived, and where my girlfriend of this time also lives. But in any case, we got in the car in midday, and it was pouring rain. And we got as far as Lebanon, Pennsylvania. There were 5 of us in the car, 2 in the front seat and 3 in the back. I was in the seat directly behind the driver, which to this day I consider to be the safest spot in a car, other than the driver's seat. I think the driver's seat is the safest, because I think when an accident occurs, the driver tends to protect themselves instinctively, and the seat behind the driver is the next safest, because it's closest to the driver in effect. But anyway, we were driving on a very rain-slick highway in a very light automobile, a Ford Falcon, and the driver lost control of the car, flipped the medial strip, and got hit by 2 oncoming cars at combined speed of over 100 miles an hour, I guess. We were going 55, and the other people were probably going 55. And so I was the only one conscious after this accident. The fellow next to me had a broken collarbone and a broken pelvis. And the guy that was next to him, the farthest from the driver, was dead. And I then had to, at age 18, just turned 18, I had to go to the morgue of the hospital in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, and identify the body of this young man. Obviously, that was a transformational experience for me. I went back to college, and the Saturday after Thanksgiving, I was cooking steaks on the back loading dock, and I accidentally had my hand slammed in the loading dock door, which was quite heavy. And so I still have the scars on my fingers from that time. And so that was excruciatingly physically painful, not to mention the psychic pain of the death of my classmate. So I stumbled through the next few weeks of college, but the night before we went home for Christmas vacation, my roommate and I drank a 5th of Johnny Walker Red Label in about a half an hour, the 2 of us. And I think we drank it pretty much straight. And so obviously I was very far gone, and it took at least 2 weeks to get fully conscious again. I mean, I had a terrible hangover for 3 days. But I mean, it's obviously getting drunk in the face of all that pain did soothe my pain, but it almost killed me. And so, I think that we have to be careful about how we advise people about using things that change the way their psyche operates, honestly. But anyway, so let's see. Andreas and Nick like my answer, and Taurus concurs. Hafren Heffron Maria Soldas says, glad to catch you live. Nice to have you here. Andreas says, I went on an enlightenment kick and I wound up on psychiatric hold. Haha. Piecing myself back together has been a long process. Dan says, was John in your old reading group? His voice sounds familiar. Yes, John is one of the original local members of the group. And Taurus says, oh Lord, haha. And Nick says, Deum. I'm sorry, I don't quite understand what that means, but if you want to inform me, that would be great. Let's see. So, John, you had a question you wanted me to address. You want to go for it?
I haven't looked up in my glossary, so I've been lazy, but I've been curious what you think is the answer to the question, what is the difference between the collective conscious and the collective unconscious? So we're only talking about the collective aspect of the psyche.
Okay, well, the collective conscious we can see on cable news every night. The collective unconscious, we can't see what's motivating what's on the news every night. Okay, and so, for example, when someone creates a scapegoat, okay, for whatever reason, they say, it wasn't me, it was that guy over there, okay, that did such and such. It's their fault. Whenever they're doing that, what they're doing is they're feeling huge internal guilt. I mean, this is my opinion, so anybody out there in YouTube land is welcome to answer this also. But from my perspective, they have unconscious guilt, which is very painful to hold internally. And so therefore, they create a scapegoat, okay?
That would be a projection?
A projection. They put it outside themselves. And this is, scapegoat is an actual thing. I mean, going back thousands of years, actually, there was the practice of taking a goat, literally taking a goat, and putting it outside the village, staking it outside the village, and saying, you know, all of my negative ideas go to that goat. They project it on the goat. They blame everything on the goat. And then they would leave the goat to be killed by a lion or whatever was out there. But then they would escape their personal responsibility for whatever the situation was. And so whenever we're blaming someone, I mean, you know, there's lots of blaming that goes around on cable news, regardless of what station you watch and regardless of which party you favor. And in every case, that demonstrates a lack of individuation and a lack of, and a feeling of guilt that someone feels they have to put the guilt on somebody else so that they don't have to carry it in their psyche. And I guess.
So wouldn't that be the personal unconscious, though, working in that person rather than the collective unconscious?
Well,
in other words, give me an example.
Well, I mean,
of a collective unconscious position or entity.
Well, I mean, from an American political point of view, we could say that the current administration was elected because of the collective shadow. Okay, in other words, as I said, believe it or not, I said this in the third meeting of this group, so you can find it back in year 1 of our videos in session 3. But everybody has been put down by somebody in authority, and whoever they are. I mean, you've been told to go to the principal's office or whatever it is in your lifetime. Everybody's been punished for some wrong. And so when Donald Trump comes up and says during his campaign, you know, I'm going to stick it to the authorities, I'm going to drain the swamp, you know, and I'm, you know, I'm going to fix it like that, everybody says, yeah, okay, or a lot of people do, okay, because they're saying, you know, my life hasn't been very good lately, not particularly not since the crash of 2008. And so I'm angry at the authorities. And so if somebody's going to shake up the authorities, boy, that's for me. And so that's in our shadow, and a lot of people voted that way in the American election. And so that's the collective acting out. And then, oh, by the way, we get hugely surprised when we vote one way, and then the guy you voted for does the opposite of what he said he would do. And that's an issue.
So does the collective conscious relate to the collective unconscious on a case basis? In other words, the same flavor that we're talking about is in people's collective unconscious. Does that come out somehow as a part of the collective consciousness then, or what's the dynamic that works?
Well, I mean, it's all process, right? It's psychological process, and it's flowing around. And, you know, here's one issue for all of us, which is none of this has been very well researched. I mean, Dr. Jung did what he could in his lifetime, obviously. But even at the end of his life, when he was interviewed by the BBC, he says, we know nothing, we know no thing about the unconscious. And so there are universes of information, of knowledge, that we don't know how these things work. Okay, and so what I believe is, of course, I'm highly intuitive, so I end up testing on the MBTI. I test in the 99th percentile on the intuitive scale. Most men aren't even in the intuitive scale, but I happen to test way out on the end of that scale. And as an intuitive, I believe it's possible to know when the mood of the country changes. I mean, actually, this was covered in the movie The American President, where they're talking about some sort of polling that had gone on, and one of the advisors says, well, the country has mood swings, right?
I like that.
and somebody else says, mood swings? Well, yes, it does. Okay, and you can tell when the mood swings. And, you know, a very obvious one in the past week, regardless of your position on this issue, is the children being separated from their parents at the border. Obviously, the mood of the country got very much darker when that happened. That was so obvious you couldn't escape it. And that wasn't just one person, that wasn't individual people, that was people everywhere objecting. And, you know, except the people who are totally sycophantic to the president. But everyone else said, you know, this is just not morally right. And you could feel the mood of the country change. And things don't change without emotion, I think. I think that's fair enough to say. I mean, you can write all kinds of rational books. I have a whole bookcase of them here. Debbie has a whole bookcase of them there. We can memorize all the books and rationality that we want in our lives. But we don't, you know, unless something is goring my ox, unless the ox is being gored, I don't tend to change. I tend to live my life more or less the same every day. But if something's really bothering me, then I'm going to change. And so we see it. We saw it when the Parkland high school kids started to react to the fact that 17 of their classmates have been killed in this shooting back in April. And we're seeing it now with this issue. We saw it when the president was inaugurated, and the following day there was this huge demonstration. And we're going to see it this weekend. On June 30th, there's a scheduled demonstration. So we can actually see the emotion that moves people to get out of their chair and physically go out and represent themselves in a crowd. Okay, and we used to think that all issues could be resolved rationally. Well, no, they can't. And things are only going to change when people are emotionally invested enough so that they change them, basically. I guess that's what I would say. Let's go back and see what's going on here. Damn. Okay, now I understand. Taurus, thank you. Okay. Andrea says, I think that the collective unconscious is further down. It's like our operating system. It's the deeper machination and the things that drives religious experiences. Well, it certainly is that, Andreas. I agree with that. And he says, collective consciousness is like a shared opinion. Yep, I agree with that too. You know, Dr. Jung made a point when he was interviewed of saying that, you know, the unconscious is really unconscious. And so I'm not saying everyone can close their eyes and know what the mood of the country is. I'm saying I can know, okay? I know because I'm intuitive, and, you know, I can read the tea leaves and know what's going on. And, you know, we're talking about a dichotomy within the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And on one side are sensing people, and on the opposite side are intuitive people. And sensing people, you have to show them 1,000 trees and they still don't believe there's a forest, whereas intuitive people, you can show them 3 trees and they assume there's a forest. That's the difference on the extremes of that duality. And so it depends on where you fall in the percentiles on that duality, whether you can know what the mood of the country is, or what, and, you know, it's just, I just know. And I don't know why I know, but I often predict things that turn out to be true. So anyway, and then Andrea says, maybe another word for collective consciousness is zeitgeist. Yeah, we've heard that word bantied about lately in the last decade or so. I don't think it's very meaningful to most Americans, unfortunately. But yes, it's. I think Dr. Jung would call it the spirit of the age, as opposed to the spirit of the depths. So the spirit of the age forces us to do things like when World War I got going. The spirit of the age in Germany was, oh, let's all go out and get our uniforms and get our guns. And so he talked about when he crossed the frontier between France and Germany, or France and Switzerland, I think. And he said everybody was in a very festive mood. They were celebrating, oh boy, we're going to have a war, goody, goody. And of course, then, 8 million men were killed in the trenches, something like that. So
I saw the same thing happen with our first Gulf War, where in my local community, there were people out there holding up signs praising the start of the war.
Yeah.
And of course, my generation went through Vietnam, and we were like, "Whoa, what do you?
Yeah, what do you think you're getting in?
You know what you're getting into here."
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, that's the way it works. So Taurus is, as the youngest in my family, I can definitely feel the scapegoat projection on me. I have lots of unconscious guilt. I have no doubt about that. I mean, I used to hive off my guilt on my brother or my sister, which is maybe why so many families are dysfunctional. If you're under the influence of the collective unconscious, you're going to do irrational things. You won't be able to explain your motivations, but you won't have to explain your motivations. Well, Andreas, I think that from Dr. Jung's point of view, he was talking about psychic epidemics. And basically, that's what you're describing here is a psychic epidemic, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I'm not a professional. Maybe you are. You won't have to explain your motivations because everyone else is on the same page as you. They're doing the same irrational religious practices that they find meaningful. Right. I guess what Dr. Jung would say is that religious practices per se, probably he would say are not irrational, are not stupid, in the sense that religious practices, regardless of religion, have been developed archetypally through human consciousness for thousands of years. All of them have. And they all have worked as psychic systems to help people through difficult times of various sorts. A good example would be confession in the Catholic Church, where you can get rid of your guilt by going to see the priest, and the priest gives you some penance and says, okay, you're absolved now. And then you can get rid of your guilt that way. And so those were all psychic technologies, I think. And so although religious statements are, often don't comport with the physical world, they don't comport with the scientific method, they do have, the fact that we need meaning in our lives is significant. And probably, so Andreas, you're a smart guy. Andreas signed off to go have cocktails and local beer, so okay. Okay, I was trying to get a photograph up, but didn't, I don't know if I can do it because the photograph wants to be on its side, but I'm going to make one more attempt. This is a photograph of that was in my local marina the other day, and hopefully this one will work. Let's try it. Ah, okay. All right. So this boat was in my local marina the other day, and it's a huge boat. It says on the side of it that it's 63 feet long, and it says never enough. And the issue is that in our materialistic world, it's never enough. You can never have enough. But what I find, if I can get the other picture up. Okay, so here's my local marina. Unfortunately, it's not showing the bottom of this picture. But what I find is that all this fiberglass, all these boats that are never enough and all kinds of other cutesy names, they also are always in port. And I think that the reason for that is that materialism, which became a kind of god for, at least for Americans and for many others around the world, and still is for many others around the world, became a kind of god. It actually does not satisfy the spiritual need. And everybody has a spiritual need, they just don't know it. And so when people strive to have bigger and bigger boats and it's never enough, you get the one boat and the first thing you say when you go out boating is, oh, we need a bigger boat. And until you get to that boat that I just showed you, never enough. And then they just sit there in the marina because it's not satisfying as you think it would be. It's just like having a fancy car in your garage or in your parking lot. It might have given you great pleasure to be in the Mercedes showroom and buy the Mercedes, but in the end, it's just a vehicle that's got four wheels and it gets you where you want to go. And so it was just hubris that got you to buy the Mercedes. But in the end, just like the truck that my friend John drives, and at one point I had a 21-year-old Camry that we were driving. Those get us around also, and they sit in the parking lot right next to all the fancy cars. And so there's no spiritual satisfaction in that. That's my observation.
So when you say, to clarify, when you say that materialism is the new God, it's a God, but it's an insufficient God, right?
It's not a satisfying God because it doesn't satisfy the spiritual need. You're striving spiritually to get to that point where you have this thing, and then you get the thing, and you just want another thing.
But that's based on an old religious structure, isn't it? Of an American, for instance, an American religious structure that said that, hey, God will reward you if you're virtuous, and that's the measure of your virtue.
Right, except that's the wrong thing to be looking for in your religion, too.
But I mean, all I'm saying is, isn't that the origin of it?
Well, I think that may be the origin.
So there is a deeper spiritual paradigm, but it's a defective one.
Well, it's a defective one because at some point you get to the point of having bigger and bigger things, and I intentionally bought a house with a very small lawn, but most people who buy a house will buy a house with a huge lawn, and then they spend 3 or 4 hours out on the lawn every weekend cutting the grass. And I cut my grass in 15 minutes this morning. So, the point is that with materialism, it's spiritually satisfying to try to strive for things, but then you get there and you find out it isn't what you thought it would be. And so Dr. Jung sort of covered it in, let's see if I have the red book here. Well, I don't have it handy.
Got the big one.
Yeah, never mind. Anyway, the gist of it is in the 7 Sermons of the Dead. If I can find that quickly, the ghosts, Jung has a vision of these ghosts visiting his house in 1916, and they knock on the door very intensely. It's a vision. You think of it as a kind of dream, and when he opens the door, they say, "We have been to Jerusalem, where we found not what we wanted." And so it seems to me that's sort of the message of materialism, which is, you think that you want something, whatever it is, whether it's a woman that you're going to marry or whatever, and you don't find what you actually need. And so, I mean, if it's a man or a woman that is going to become your spouse, you have this honeymoon period where you project onto them the perfect mate. And then 6 weeks after the wedding, you find out that your spouse snores or something. I'll be a little bit delicate here. You find out your spouse snores and wakes you up 4 or 5 times a night. And so that's not quite as pretty and beautiful as you thought it would be. And so then you have to come back and learn about reality and learn how to be a mature human being and learn how to start to learn how to individuate, because the world isn't the way you imagined it when you were 5 years old and daddy was calling you princess, that sort of thing. Let's see. Okay. Taurus says, by the way, I love the Yasha Heifetz story, and thank you for the no fat video. Okay, that's the first.
Everybody loves the Yasha Heifetz story.
Yeah, that's my most popular story, and Taurus, you're the first to praise the no fat video. It helped me out on seeing a different perspective on the topic. From Maria says, interesting. Dan Pohl says, John must be an engineer or scientist. He's very insistent on getting a thorough understanding of the definitions, lots of logos. Your comment, John.
Well, I actually do engineering work, although I only had 2 years of engineering school. But that's all you need, because the rest is just specialization. So the first 2 years of engineering school turn you into an engineer.
Right.
But also my father was an engineer. He was a very senior civil engineer.
Right.
Structural engineer and so forth. And so I'm sort of steeped in it. So that's a very observant comment.
Right.
From the person who made it. Yeah.
And interestingly, lots of the things that we discuss in group and have discussed over the last 2 years now have to do with Eros, because John is an engineer and interested in a lot of logos types of things, but the Eros side is the side that needs to be addressed, maybe. John is my most loyal member who probably, this is the 84th session of the group, and John has probably attended about 65 sessions, I would guess, at least, over the last 2 years. Nick says, question, what is your perspective on using tools against that? I am a combat vet with PTSD. I have a service dog, but know that that dog will most likely not outlive me. The solutions seem morbid. It seems the medicine only postpones the hardship. In the case of survivor's guilt, my dog got cancer, was at the vet today deciding options, put me in a strange perspective on whether this bond is good or bad in the end. One of those, is it really better to have loved and lost things? I suppose. Dog saved my life 5 years ago. Now I cannot save his. If you are virtuous, you do not seek reward. Good evening, Lara. Lara. That's our friend. One of our regular in-person members has joined us online, so I'm delighted to see you. So, Nick, here's my quandary about your question. Your question touches on mental health and psychoanalysis, and I am not a licensed psychotherapist, and so I have never taken a formal psychology course per se, and so I'm very reluctant to answer your questions directly. I will have something to say about PTSD in a minute, because I have it a bit, not very much, but a little bit. And my purpose in this group is to say, number one, I've never had an analysis per se. And what I have found is that through the slings and arrows of my life, when I had Dr. Jung with me, he in effect became my therapist. And I think what happens is that by reading Dr. Jung, you're reading at the archetypal level, which tends to open up the psychoid layer. And about 2 weeks ago in session, I discussed the psychoid layer. So you might want to go back through some of the recent videos and just hear that discussion. It was in a group meeting like this about 2 weeks ago. And so if you look for some of the longer videos, those are videos that are taken during our sessions. And so if you open up the psychoid layer, which is in the very deep unconscious, then something happens, something mysterious happens that makes you better able to face whatever it is that you have to face. And, you know, from the point of view of having a pet, I've had 3, and so, you know, my purpose is just to open Jung's work up to others because he's been so helpful to me. I consider him my therapist, even though he's been dead for over nearly 60 years now. And I can pick up any of his books and I find it very soothing personally. I guess we could have a couple of comments about pets. Obviously, it's very painful when you have a pet, and you know, I think my three collies, I had three collie dogs, they always were soothing to me, and they were good for my mental health. And it was always very painful in the back of my mind to know that they were only going to live for 10 years or 11 years. Average life of a collie is about 10 years. And so, you know, that's kind of the bittersweet of having that pet. But it is life. And there's actually a Buddhist teaching in this. There's my favorite Buddhist teaching, which I sometimes tell, is this. A woman has a 6-month-old baby who has died in her arms, and she goes to see the Buddha. And the Buddha she says to the Buddha, "Please bring my baby back to life." And the Buddha said, "Well, I will do that if you will bring me a mustard seed from the house in the community that has seen no death." And of course, the woman can't do that. And so part of maturity is knowing that we have to live between the two extremes. Scylla and Charybdis are the two extremes in the Odyssey, where the rocks are on both sides and you have to get down the middle. And I guess what I would suggest in terms of your pet, your dog, your service dog, is to give him or her as much comfort as you can during her lifetime, knowing that it's probably short. And if you know you've done everything that you can for them to give them as positive a life as possible, then I think you probably will be okay. I'm not saying it's not painful. It is painful to lose a pet. And, you know, I've bawled my eyes out every time I've had to put a pet down, and I've had to do it 3 times. And, you know, I don't know. Do you have any comments on this, John?
Well, I have a little bit of insight about with a friend who is a life coach who deals with soldiers from the war who have PTSD, very bad PTSD, and have had their friends killed around them and that sort of thing, and have been severely injured. And the only thing that I know that the way he approaches it is that it's turning the warrior within oneself to the healer. Yeah. So the conversion is from, not that that everyone has a warrior archetype, but it's sort of common to soldiers that they have that, and therefore that turning that into a healer archetype is very beneficial for them.
You know, I noticed that Ann Ulanoff, who's emerita professor of psychiatry and religion at Union Theological Seminary, said that there are 3 types of mental health healing. The first type is the type that I discussed in the Buddha story, which is to show you that you're not alone, that we all suffer this pain, whatever it is, the suffering, because suffering is a part of life. And in Buddhism, that's one of the four basic tenets of, of life. You know, in Buddhism, they say the beauty of birth, the certainty of death, samsara, which is suffering, and karma, which is Buddhist for what goes around comes around. And so the story I just told about the Buddha is saying that, you know, we all suffer this pain. And, you know, maybe that is a way of healing. The second way is through gaining a religious outlook. And it doesn't mean by any specific creed. It means having a religious experience such that you know, okay? You don't have to believe, you know. And if you haven't read it before, I urge you to go and look for the links to Edward Edinger's talks that are on a variety of videos on this channel. And then the third level is to gain access to the psychoid layer. And so that I'm going to refer you to the talk that I gave on that a couple weeks back. Maybe I'll look back for a link to it shortly. But as far as PTSD is concerned, I have a very, very mild form of PTSD. And I know that it is totally intransigent. Okay, there's absolutely nothing I can do about it. And mine emerges every time I hear a helicopter and every time I hear fireworks on the 4th of July or any other day when I hear fireworks. I'm immediately back in Vietnam. And there's nothing I can do about that. I immediately flash back when that happens. And I live in Annapolis, Maryland, which has the Naval Academy next to it. So we often have helicopters flying over. And so whenever I'm outside and a helicopter flies over, it flashes me back. And that is intransigent. I don't expect it to change in my lifetime. In the case of the fireworks, I simply avoid it. I simply do not go outside for fireworks. If I watch fireworks, I watch it on television. In the case of the helicopter, I say, okay, that's my PTSD coming up. And some things, as Dr. Jung said, some things you don't cure, you just grow out of, or they become less important than other things. And so when I have the helicopter response, I simply say, okay, that's my PTSD coming up, and I'll just put that aside in my psyche. That's the way I do it. But I'm not sure that that would be enough if you have a more serious PTSD. And if that's true, then I urge you to talk to a real mental health professional. You know, as far as the fact that the dog saved your life, you know, that's very meaningful, and you can find ways to memorialize that one way or another. I certainly do it. In fact, I put the photograph of one of my colleagues as the thumbnail on one of these videos recently. Okay, so
You know, too, Skip, just another thought on that is that I know it's a little cliche, but if if we stay in touch with our feelings, I think Jung even made a statement about how the importance of that, and that's how we connect with our core self, and that should be practiced, and or feelings written down, feelings described, and
Right.
that's extremely important for any kind of mental health or um, soul searching to
Right.
get through things.
Okay, so I mean, I can give you a response like that. Um, okay, here is, I found the link to the correct video, so let me give you that. And, you know, I guess I can offer what I think a friend would say to you. Okay, I don't claim that this is mental health advice at all. Um, and, you know, what I try to put into this um, YouTube channel is things which I think would help me if I were in a position and help me in some way. And so, um, you know, what I just put, the link I just put on there, Nick, is the link to the discussion about psychic healing. It happens to be the one that has the image of my colleague on the as the thumbnail, and and you know, even just looking at that image soothes me. You know, even though he's gone, he still lives in my heart. And I guess that's one way to think about it. You know, I lost my brother 30 years ago. When he was 39 years old, he died, and he was poisoned by, believe it or not, bad water in Vail, Colorado. And he got this amoebic thing called Giardia, I'm not sure how to pronounce it exactly, which exists in the Colorado River. And that's in one summer in 1973, the city of Vail brought untreated water into the water supply of Vail, Colorado, and 300 people that were in Vail for the summer, that summer, got this amoebic infection, which ultimately ate their livers. And it actually was the origin of liver transplants in the United States, because Dr. Thomas Starzl, who pioneered liver transplant in the United States, was at the University of Denver at that time working with pigs. And suddenly he had all these human patients that were coming in. And so it was such a dire situation that he had to start transplanting. And my brother had, in 1988, it took 15 years for the stuff to eat his liver. But ultimately, he had 3 liver transplants in one summer, and then he died. But very honest, and so obviously it's very painful to lose a sibling or someone like that. But what I find is that my brother is still with me every bit as much as he ever was. And so is my father, and so is my mother. And, you know, even my roommate from the basic school, who was killed in Vietnam on April the 11th, 1969, even he is very close to me still. And, you know, I don't think of him as dead. I think of him as with me. And certainly with that, thumbnail of my dog, whose name is Karma, prosaically enough, but Karma saved my life many times, not literally in the sense that your dog may have done, but he certainly kept me exercising every day, and just his way of being in the world, which you can see in that picture, I find very soothing, and he's still with me. And what I can say is that I wish I hadn't had to euthanize him, but I knew that I had to, and it was my mature duty as an adult to take care of that and help him with that. Otherwise, he would have suffered very badly. He didn't know that. He didn't know he was at the end of his life. And so for him, it was just something that happened very quickly. And, you know, and we can regret we have to do that, but if we're going to be mature adults about it, then we do have to. To the extent I can say anything. Thomas says, Asclepius, god of healing, has a dog mixed into his myths. I've had traumatic dreams in which my dog, whose name was also Karma, helped lead me out of dangerous, untenable situations. I wouldn't be surprised at all to hear that, and certainly you know, that can come up all the time. Let's see. I think I wanted to get through a couple of things here in the Secret of the Golden Flower. We haven't really gotten to it. And we haven't, let's see. I am trying to be responsive, though, to your issues. Okay, John, thank you for coming. Come again. Come next week. Every week. You're welcome.
Okay, take care. Thanks.
Feel free to chat with Deb on your way out. Okay, so let's address a couple things. One is I mentioned in I believe it's in the, let's just see. Yeah. Okay, so here in the information below this video is a link to a talk by Jonathan Pajot, and I urge everyone to look at that because one of the issues that's constantly in Jungian psychology is symbolism. And unfortunately, although Dr. Jung talks about symbolism all the time, he never really sort of pins it down. And so when I found this video by Jonathan Pajot, I thought he had done really the best job I've ever seen of discussing symbolism. So rather than me try to regurgitate what I took down in my own notes, but I did take notes on what he said, and I thought this video is very good, so I would urge you to take a look at that. Okay, so that was one thing I wanted to mention. So we get up to now paragraph 38 of The Secret of the Golden Flower, and I want to remind you that this Secret of the Golden Flower commentary that Dr. Jung did almost prefigures very much of Jungian psychology, in my view. And so as we go through these items, I think it's very helpful to talk through each of these things. They're, we may not get through it fast, but we are addressing the mainstream issues. This is not a sidelight of Jungian psychology. This is the main deal here. And you know, it gets presented in different ways. And so in paragraph 38, he's talking about the circumambulatio. And I recall telling my group early on, a couple of years back, that we would be circling around the center. And they probably figured, well, okay, we'll do that in a couple of weeks. And actually what happens is you start going down, and you keep going down and down and down and down and deeper. And there's actually no end to it, that you keep going around the center, and you mark off the sacred precinct, and it's a question of fixation and concentration. And so you're moving in a circle around yourself, and so all sides of the personality become involved. And just recall now, there's the image here. Okay, so just recall the image that's on The Secret of the Golden Flower. This golden flower actually represents the Great One, the psyche, which is emerging in all of us from the time of our birth. And so it's not us cramming stuff down into our minds. That's, of course, what I thought we were doing when I went to college, business school, and law school. But it's not that at all. It's finding our psyche is constantly trying to blossom in the same way a flower blossoms, and a flower knows what it's doing. And so at depth, our instincts know what they need. Let's put it that way. And so our self is constantly trying to tell us what we need, and that comes across in dreams and visions. And so I think that would be the way to describe it. I hope that's the way to describe it. If you're not following me, please let me know. In paragraph 39, then, Dr. Jung says that the movement is activating the light and dark sides of nature, self-know by self-brooding. So it's a question of examining yourself. You can't do it. You know, when I was 40 years old, I turned off the radio, honestly. And you know, we live in a society where they want you to have a radio on and music playing in your ears all the time. And if you do that, you're not going to hear yourself. And I remember making a conscious choice when I was 40 years old to just turn the radio off. And when I did that, it was almost a sensation of fearfulness. I was afraid of what I would hear if I turned the radio off, what would come up from my unconscious, because obviously if we're blaring out the messages of our unconscious, we're not going to get anything. But if we turn the radio off, then we can hear ourselves think. And so I think that's a useful thing to do. I noticed that on the Toyotas that I've had recently, whenever I get in the car, it's automatically playing something off my iTunes, and I cannot figure out how to turn that off. And I mean, I can't figure out how to turn off the functionality that automatically turns on some of the music in my iTunes, and so I have to consciously turn off the radio every single time, and I find that very irritating. I don't know, is it a way to control us? Maybe it is, because if we can't hear ourselves think, then we can't think about anything that the powers that be might not like us to think about. Okay, so in paragraph 40 now, there's a very interesting experience that Edward Maitland had in the 19th century, and it's and so I wanted to read it to you. Okay, it was Edward Maitland was the biographer of an empath named Anna Kingsford. And so his book is Anna Kingsford, Her Life, Letters, Diary, and Work. But he had a central experience, and this is going back to the issue of religious experience. So this is in paragraph 40 of The Secret of the Golden Flower. And here's what Jung says. He had discovered that when reflecting on an idea, related ideas became visible, so to speak, in a long series apparently reaching back to their source, which to him was the divine spirit. By concentrating on this series, he tried to penetrate to their origin. He writes, I was absolutely without knowledge or expectation when I yielded to the impulse to make the attempt. I simply experimented on a faculty, being seated at my writing desk the while in order to record the results as they came, and resolved to retain my hold on my outer and circumferential consciousness, no matter how far toward my inner and central consciousness I might go, for I knew not whether I should be able to regain the former if I once quitted my hold of it, or to recollect the facts of the experience. At length I achieved my object, though only by a strong effort, the tension occasioned by the endeavor to keep both extremes of the consciousness in view at once being very great. Once well started on my quest, I found myself traversing a succession of spheres or belts, the impression produced being that of mounting a vast ladder stretching from the circumference toward the center of a system, which was at once my own system, the solar system, the universal system, the three systems being at once diverse and identical. Presently, by a supreme and what I felt was a final effort, I succeeded in polarizing the whole of the convergent rays of my consciousness into the desired focus. And at the same instant, as if through the sudden ignition of the rays thus fused into a unity, I found myself confronted with a glory of unspeakable whiteness and brightness, and of a luster so intense as well nigh to beat me back. But though feeling that I had to explore further, I resolved to make assurance doubly sure by piercing, if I could, the almost blinding luster. By piercing, if I could, the almost blinding luster, and seeing what it enshrined. With a great effort I succeeded, and the glance revealed to me that which I felt must be there. It was the dual form of the sun, the unmanifest made manifest, the unformulate formulate, the unindividuate individuate, God as the Lord, proving through his duality that God is substance as well as force, love as well as will, feminine as well as masculine, mother as well as father. Paragraph 41, Dr. Jung says, he found that God is two in one, like man, Besides this, he noticed something that our text also emphasizes, namely suspension of breathing. Okay. So that was a description of Edward Maitland's religious experience. It sounds very much like Nicholas of Cusa's experience as I understand it, and I acknowledge that I'm not well versed on Nicholas of Cusa. So Dr. Jung also said in paragraph 41, it amounted to a rebirth on a different plane of existence. And I think that the point is that once you've had one of these religious experiences, then you know. Then you don't need to believe, you know. And so I've actually had 2 of them on video, which if you look at, there's a playlist on this channel called Breakthroughs to the Unconscious, and on that playlist you'll find a couple of my actual breakthroughs on the video and descriptions of others that I've had in my lifetime. Paragraph 42, vision of the light is an experience common to many mystics, unconditioned and absolute, combination of supreme power and profound meaning. And what I thought was interesting was that it seemed to me like E equals mc squared. Everything is either energy or matter, and it's the switching back and forth between the two that drives the universe. Let's see here. Dennis says Eshwing television, also a counterculture thing to do, but for me necessary. Okay, is Eshwing television something in the United States, or where is it, Thomas? I'm not sure. Anyway, so in paragraph 43, he's talking about an acute state of consciousness as intense as it is abstract. It's detached consciousness, and it cannot be attained by conscious will. Consciousness is always partisan. Unconscious can be reached only by symbols. This is Dr. Jung's position. And paragraph 45 cannot be thought up. It touches on the deepest layers. I have a note here, the ancient Rhodesia example, which is an example of the mandala, which is what the golden flower is also. So it's the mandala is always representing a central point of consciousness. And let's see. Let me get through one more paragraph, and then I'll show you a couple things. Okay, so it has to grow from forgotten depths, its loftiest intuitions of the spirit, and it fuses present-day consciousness to age-old past life. And probably shouldn't start this now because we're so close to the end of the time today. So what I will do is I will start on paragraph 46, which is about disintegration of consciousness, next week. And just to tantalize you a little bit, paragraph 46, he says, the unconscious has a decidedly disintegrating effect on consciousness. And so this is something that's pretty serious. Maybe I can get through some of this. Okay, let me give it a go, and I'm going to share my notes for a few minutes here. I think I'm going to share my notes. Oh, here we go. Okay. So I will share my notes for a few minutes. These are, I'm sorry about the flashing, and so I will, the reason I want to do this is because I want you to see these images. Okay, so one of the points that Dr. Jung makes in paragraph 46 is that the unconscious is decidedly disintegrating. And one of his famous quotes is this quote that 100 admirable persons in a room make one blockhead. Now, why is that? It basically says that if I'm in a room and I'm talking to you, you will go, and you won't necessarily challenge me. And the more people that are in the room, the less likely it is that you will challenge me. And so we can see this in orators, for example. The more people that are present, the more people will say or cheer, and the fewer people that will challenge, and that can become a psychic epidemic. Now, Dr. Jung wanted to talk about this meditation symbol here. This is the fourth stage of meditation, and of course, from the golden flower point of view, the adept is looking at issues from all points of view. So he's got 5 disciples, and he's looking at whatever issue it is from all 5 disciples' point of view. And he's also, in this case, looking at it from the 5 disciples' point of view of all the 5 disciples. So he's actually looking at a problem from 25 different points of view. And this is the best way to solve a problem. But as Dr. Jung says, this would be a schizophrenic process if it were to become a permanent state. So in other words, these images, you have to remember that they are illusions, that they're not real. And so in Buddhist meditation, you think of them as illusions, and you think of them, you know that they will go away. If they can be autonomous psychic entities, however, and so if they become that, then you get the Sybil phenomenon, where you get multiple personalities going around in your unconscious, and then you're in trouble. And so the one thing I wanted you to remember is too much of the animal distorts civilized man. Too much civilization makes sick animals. Now, so the mandala is the protecting circle, and it was seized upon to protect the unity of consciousness from being burst asunder by the unconscious. And so there's mandalas that have been found as long ago as 35,000 years. And what's interesting to me is that these 2 symbols that are beneath the colorful one here are symbols from the movie Arrival, and these are the method of writing of the aliens. And if you look at symbols of the Ouroboros, the one on the left here, which looks like which has a sun in it, that is an alchemical Ouroboros. And the one, well, they're both alchemical Ouroboros, but the one on the left is from the 16th or so century. The one on the right is from the 3rd century. So the Ouroboros also symbolizes the creative impulse of the new beginning. It is the wheel that rolls of itself, the initial rotary movement in the upward spiral of evolution. And I took that from Erich Neumann's The Origins and History of Consciousness. Dr. Neumann was one of Dr. Jung's closest disciples. And here are examples. Kekule supposedly got the idea for the structure of benzene in 1872 because he had a dream of the Ouroboros. And so here you can see his description of the structure of benzene. And that intuition came to him because he had a dream of the Ouroboros. So it runs through the whole of Buddhism as well. So as you see here in the Golden Flower, the first stage of meditation, the adept is simply gathering himself. Then in the second step on the right side, you see him feeling something that's happening from his center, in this case from his gut. And then in the third case, you see the image of the adept with the adept looking down on himself. And so he's out of duality now. He's looking down on himself and his problems as a detached person. And what's interesting about this, and I think what captured Dr. Jung's attention, is the image on the right is an image that he made, Dr. Jung made in the Red Book about 10 years before he saw this other image. And in Dr. Jung's image, this is the adept who is Christ, and he is over the city of Geneva, and he has above him the energy of the Holy Spirit, presumably, something like that is meant. And so what got Dr. Jung's attention was that the imagery from the East from 3,000 years ago is the same imagery that evolved in his own mind. And so then, of course, this runs through all of Buddhism, the favorable as well as the unfavorable are illusions and still to be overcome. So, if you're having ideas like that and they're running amok with your unconscious, then you need mental health help, and for schizophrenia possibly. But this is also an image of having wholeness in your life, of being able to see every issue that comes up in your life from a different perspective. Okay, and Dr. Jung says, note, the psychologist is concerned not with the substantiality of these complexes, but with psychic experience. Without a doubt, they are psychic contents that can be experienced, and their autonomy is equally indubitable. They are fragmentary psychic systems that either appear spontaneously in ecstatic states and evoke powerful impressions and effects, or else in mental disturbances become fixed in the form of delusions and hallucinations, and consequently destroy the unity of the personality. So this isn't toys we play with, folks, but nonetheless, just being aware of it can be helpful. I'm going to stop the lecture per se at this point and go back to your points. Thomas says, doing without television, a comment on you're doing without radio at age 40. I say, oh, eschewing. I'm sorry, I just didn't understand the word when I looked at it. Eschewing television. Well, I don't eschew television, but I keep it in its place. I watch it 1 or 2 hours a day. Yeah, eschew is for me to do without or to forego. Yes, I'm sorry. I just didn't know because some of our other members use different names, and I didn't know whether I was looking at a foreign word or not. And there's a lot going on when I'm trying to broadcast a live stream like this. Thomas says, Chartric Cathedral's labyrinth is perhaps an example of a Western mandala. Also see mandorla. Yeah, definitely. Mandorla is two mandalas that cross one another, and in the center where the two are common is, you know, the best part, the common meeting ground. That's where a marriage is best, and obviously you'd want to have a good mandorla in your psyche for your marriage. And also at Chartres is the rose window, which rose windows appear in almost all cathedrals, and they are ways of pulling, right, the mandorla is an almond shape, right, and it, but the mandala of the rose windows is a way to pull the psyche together and to make one feel comfortable. And so, as I said, when I was 30 and a deacon in the Reformed Church, I didn't know why, but when I went to church on Sunday, I felt better afterward. I didn't know why, and I'm starting to understand that there was something unconscious going on in the ritual that was helping me, but at that time I really didn't have a clue. I couldn't figure it out. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop on that. Yeah. And I'll start with paragraph 48 next time. So any other questions before I discontinue the video, because we have about 5 minutes left before we're going to run out of time with YouTube, and then they start cutting off the beginning of the video. So I'd like to terminate within, let's say, within about another 5 minutes. Just, but I'm happy to answer any other comments or allow any other comments. I'm going to take my notes off the screen at this point. And also, I am going to put my contact information up. This will allow you, if you want to have access to our Dropbox, you can write me at skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will put you in our Dropbox. And I urge you to join our advanced reading group, where we are studying in great detail Ion, and we are doing that on Zoom, so it is a video conference in which all of you can participate by voice and not only by chat, as you can hear. Is David? Yes, David Garrett's son, S-A-N, is my nom de plume. And what do you think Dr. Jung meant by symbol? Well, I think you should go and watch Jonathan Pajot, because I don't think I can sum it up that easily. And he's done a marvelous job. I learned from him, in fact. So I'm going to leave the definition of symbol to Jonathan Pajot. But I think the overall point is that our life is in many dimensions, and those dimensions are not linear and they're not rational. And so they can only be described symbolically. So this is why when you're dreaming, your dream can't talk to you. Most of the time it can't talk to you. And sometimes I do hear an ex cathedra voice, or I see something that's written, but almost always it's not that. And even when it is that, it is symbolic, and it's up to me to interpret what it means. And so, just to give you my simplest example, every time I have a very frequent vision. It comes up every second day probably. And the vision is a vision of a modern police car going from right to left across my field of vision, with the word police across the side of the car. And every time I have that vision, I slow down and mind my P's and Q's, because I know that that vision means that within 1 minute or 2 minutes at the most, I will see police activity. It'll be a speed trap, or it will be an accident, or all kinds of things, but it will be something involving police. And in my ancient archaic brain, my deep unconscious probably interprets police as predator, I suppose. And so instead of giving me an image of a lion or a tiger, it's giving me an image of a police car, and it's saying predator or danger. Maybe not predator. Okay, that's not being kind to the police force, but it's probably saying something like, pay attention here. And I find that it always works. And so, whereas and as I said, I'm quite intuitive, so whereas an S person, a sensing person who has to get all the details, they probably need a radar detector on their dashboard. I have no need. I know when I'm going to come upon a speed trap, because there are certain cues in the environment that my unconscious picks up on, and boom, I get that image. And so that image is a symbol that tells me that that's something like that is happening. That's, I guess, the best I can do for that. Yep, that's the right book. It's called Mako, Memoir of a Woman. It's in the Dropbox, Thomas, so I hope you didn't buy it. But that is the book. And Dan says, thanks, Skip, blessings. Thomas says, I've been trying to use active imagination with dreams as I wake, and am consciously gathering up the threads of whatever I have dreamed. Any tips for using AI in further talks would be helpful. Okay, I'll think about that, Thomas. basically all I do is I try to sit quietly, and I've found that even if I've written down a dream, very often after an hour or two I'll forget, but if I've written it down, I can come back to it later in the day, not real later in the day, but maybe in mid-morning. And if I just close my eyes and put myself back in the dream because I've written down the essence of where I was or what was happening, the dream will continue, and I can just take it in a sort of a semi-conscious state. I wouldn't say that I'm unconscious. I'm not asleep, but I'm trying to block out, or I don't even actively try to block out the world. I just put myself back into that situation, and the play begins to carry on. It continues on, and you can see my video, The Dream in the Sheriff's Office, as an example of that, where I describe that. Let me see if I can find it quickly. I'll get the link to it if I can, so you can take a look at that dream. Okay, I've got it here. Just a second. Okay, so this is Skip's dream in the sheriff's office, and that is definitely a dream. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's the one. And so what I can say, I haven't done a lot of this because I haven't done a lot of active imagination in the last 20 years or so. I sort of consider the novel as all active imagination. But in that dream that is in that link, that gives you an example of how I did it. And I have done it a couple of additional times since then, and it works if you just sit there and let it happen. So anyway, I've got to shut down. So I will see you all next week, or if you are in the advanced reading group, I'll see you tomorrow at 1:30 on Zoom. And so thank you for joining me tonight.